by 1816, the old burying ground was nearly full. In 1818, the town bought adjoining plots of land here, owned by the Reverend David Palmer, who was the town's third minister, and Deacon Daniel Adams and Richard Warner, to form a quadrangular area for use as a new town cemetery, closer to what was now becoming the center of town, nearer the river and the mills. And there's a section here called Palmer Flats, because that Reverend Palmer gave that part of the land. The first burials were just behind the fence along Highland Street near the cemetery department offices in the common, and most of the burials were marked with slate stones, as in the old burying ground. When needed, additional land was purchased to add to the cemetery in 1856. Hillside Cemetery currently consists of 10 sections. There's a cremation section now, and over 8 acres, stretching from O Street to Meeting House Hill. Over 74% of the gravestones here have been photographed and added on Find a Grave, with over 4,242 listed on that site. The original map of the oldest part of the cemetery, which was drawn on a sturdy old window shade, still exists in the cemeteries and parks department offices. When rolled up for storage, it occupies very little space, yet is easily unrolled for viewing, making it a durable and practical example of Yankee ingenuity. And I'd like to start with a few quotes from the Massachusetts Book of the Dead. Chris, do you remember the woman who wrote that?
Not off the top.
No, I don't either. I should have written that down. Exploring such old burial grounds gives us the opportunity to connect with and honor our history. Our goal in regards to those resting in peace here should be to keep their memories alive by telling their stories of both the famous and the not so famous, all of whose lives have been summarized in a few brief words on stone. And I'd like to start right over here, where this flag is, in the very corner. And this is the grave of Nahum Gardner Hazard. Sometimes it's spelled with 2 Z's, and sometimes it's spelled with 1. And he lived from 1830 to 1913. I will say that he was a black man. Nahum Hazard is due a recognition for serving in the Union Army during the Civil War. Beyond that, he was a free black man from Townsend who fought in the Civil War, but his remarkable story begins years before that. His family had originally emigrated from England to Providence Plantation, like Plymouth Plantation, in Rhode Island in 1778. He was born into a free black family in Shirley, Massachusetts in 1830. His father, Emerson Hazard, died 10 years later, and his mother, Kira, remarried Benjamin Hennessy. Kira and Benjamin are also buried in this cemetery, and several Hennessy's and other Hazards. Nahum had 3 siblings, Betsy Hazard Mitchell and James Horace Hazard, who are also buried in the cemetery, and Oliver Hazard, who is resting in the Evergreen Cemetery in Leominster. Nahum also had 5 Hennessy half-siblings who are buried here in Townsend. In 1863, his younger brother Oliver, born in 1836, mustered into the Union Army as a private from Townsend and served in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Oliver was wounded in action in 1864 and mustered out in 1865. There's a monument topped with a statue dedicated to Oliver in Carter Park in Leominster. And their brother James also served in the Civil War. I do have a picture of the monument in Leominster to his brother Oliver. I'm not sure why he gets the honor and Nahum gets this stone, because Nahum was also injured in the Civil War. And now back to Nahum's story. When he was 8 years old, two white men offered his mother an apprenticeship for Nahum in a tavern in western Massachusetts. She agreed, and the boy left with them. These men were, in fact, kidnappers who profited by seizing free blacks and took them into slavery and sold them into slavery in the South. Another black boy, Sidney Francis, was abducted in Lunenburg, and the boys were taken to Richmond, Virginia by way of Springfield, Mass., New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, etc., to be sold at a slave auction. But it was proven that they had been born free, and they were returned to their families in Massachusetts. Their captors were tried in Worcester, found guilty, and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Nahum became a farmer in Townsend. He married his wife Harriet, who was buried here, in 1858, and they had 8 children. During the Civil War, Nahum served in the 55th, his brother was in the 54th, Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, Company 1. He received a shattering musket shot in his right shoulder while serving in South Carolina. Later, he became a granite wagon driver in Leominster. His wife and 3 of his children, who died very young, are also buried here. And although he moved to Leominster, his wife and children died first, so he's buried here with them. But he did farm and live in Townsend. A very detailed chronological account and map of the boys' abduction and rescue exists. And can be found on Find a Grave. And since this is the first stop, I'll quickly go over.
We have that history, don't we?
The abduction and rescue of Sidney Francis and Nahum Hazard. Everything, but September 2nd, 1839, Nahum Hazard was taken, and September 12th, Sidney Francis was taken. September 15th, having grown uneasy, Sidney Francis's father set out for Palmer, Mass. On foot to find his son. That same day, 3 of the kidnappers, on the day of the kidnapping, Dickinson Sharir is seen with Sidney Francis in Fredericksburg, Virginia. September 19th, a letter from Fredericksburg's mayor, Benjamin Clark, arrives in Worcester informing authorities of the whereabouts of the boys and asking for evidence to support their claims to be free people of color from here. Dickinson Sharir had been taken into custody. September 22nd, Worcester resident Levi Newton, nephew of the former Massachusetts Governor Levi Lincoln, observes in his diary, "Today I hear of an outrageous case of stealing of a Negro boy from this town." September 24th, George and Benjamin Rice of Worcester leave for Fredericksburg to bring back Dickinson Sharir as a prisoner to be prosecuted for kidnapping. A Lunenburg man who was in Virginia on business was asked to bring Nahum Hazard back. September 25th, a story on the kidnapping was printed in the Massachusetts Spy Notes. The circumstance has produced a strong sensation here, and much indignation is felt at the commission of so daring an outrage. September 26, George Bradbury of Boston travels to Lunenburg to investigate Nahum Hazard's abduction. He is the first to inform the boy's mother that her son has been found safe. He writes, "Joy enough, I assure you, was diffused through the bosom of the mother when I assured her that her son was safe and would soon be restored to her arms again." September 27th, the accomplice, Elias Turner, arrives in Palmer. October 2nd, Sidney Francis is returned to his parents in Worcester. It's not clear from the historical record when Nahum Hazard got home to Lunenburg, but he did. December 12th, a Virginia slave trader is charged in Nahum Hazard's abduction. Francis Wilkinson escapes from jail in Fredericksburg, and he is never tried or charged for the crime. January 28th, 1840, the trial of Dickinson, Sherrier, and Elias Turner takes place in the Worcester Court of Common Process. The men are sentenced to serve 7 years in prison, although Mr. Turner's sentence is later reduced. Well, thank you for listening. It's kind of long. It's an interesting, amazing story that I had never heard before. And now we'll go back 2 rows back here. See the 2 flags.
Yeah, so.
These are the Blood brothers. John Blood and his brother Abijah William, who was known as Will. You might have heard of John Burning Blood. He was a Civil War veteran. He lived 1839 to 1939, and his younger brother Abijah 1843 to 1863. John Burning Blood was a Civil War veteran who lived on Fitchburg Road in Townsend. During the war, he had suffered a head injury which was said to have caused him to become eccentric and odd. He had 7 siblings, including his younger brother Abijah William, known as Will, who served in Company D, the 33rd Regiment, Massachusetts Volunteers. Will died in Baltimore at the age of 20 of an illness with a high fever during the war. Now, earlier this week, I was here and there were no flags here, so I did ask the cemetery department to please have flags here for these brothers, since we're talking about them, and they were Civil War soldiers. People thought that John Burning Blood lived in poverty in his later years, but when he died in 1931, he left $10,550.85 for a Civil War monument to be placed on the Townsend Common, and it is still there today, as we know. The bronze statue of a Civil War soldier was dedicated there on Memorial Day, 1832. The bandstand had to be moved from where the statue is now to accommodate the statue. The statue originally cost $5,500, with the rest of the $10,000 going into an account for its maintenance, and the town paid for the statue's pedestal and base. Recently, the statue was restored for the 150th anniversary of the Civil War with grant money from various state commissions, and the statue's still exists. Contaminants and corrosion were removed from the porous metal, and the statue was high-pressure power washed, resealed, waxed, and restored to its former glory. Right, and now we're going to walk over to this tall monument over here. This will be the farthest one that we go to in this direction. So we'll be talking about Joel Giles, 1804 to 1882. Joel had 7 siblings. And there they are, I guess. And 4 of them died in 1800. It was common in the early days before antibiotics for whole families to become ill and for children to die of epidemic type things, or even whooping cough, or things that would not kill people today. Joel studied for college with Reverend David Palmer, the 3rd pastor. In those days, those who wanted to attend college would need to learn more than the local elementary schools would offer them, and pastors of the time were well-educated graduates of Harvard. So David Palmer taught Joel Giles, and Joel graduated from Harvard with a Bachelor of Law degree. And in 1837, he became a lawyer in Boston and achieved a distinguished career in law. He also served in both branches of the Massachusetts state legislature and later became a patent office lawyer in Boston, New York City, and Washington, D.C. The Joel Giles Fund was created when $2,000 was left in his will to provide income for cemetery improvement of the old burying ground farther up the street, and what was then, at that time, called the new burial ground. So the section that we'll be looking at today is in the new burial ground, as it was called then. Now part of Hillside Cemetery. And even the term Hillside Cemetery, where's the only hill in the cemetery in this section? Joel's father, John Giles, and most of his family are also buried here. And thanks to Joel's far-sighted gift, this fund, left in trust, still exists, providing funding for the necessary ongoing projects here, such as tree trimming and stone preservation. And here's the trustee signing off on his will. I have a copy of that. And that fund is still going strong today. Now we're going to cross over to the Reed family plot. You have been to the Reed house. Over here, the tall slate beautiful stone.
Yeah, wow, I've never seen such tall ones. Wow.
You'll notice how very high and tall these stones are. And they're still in very good condition, too. The Reed House in Townsend Harbor, now home of the Townsend Historical Society, was owned by Oliver Reed Jr. and his descendants from 1808 till 1971. Some of the gravestones in this plot are very tall, as was common at the time, and they're in very good condition. It looks like the plot is not full here. You often see this in a family plot where some of the members moved away and are buried elsewhere. Oliver Reed, 1779 to 1839, was born in Westford and moved to Townsend about 1800. He learned the tanning business and also farmed for many years. He married Letty Wilson, 1788 to 1864, next to him, in 1808, and he bought what is now known as the Reed House, which was built by John Jewett in about 1790. He bought it as a wedding gift for his bride. The couple had 5 children, the first being James W. Reed, 1814 to 1815, died as a baby. The second was Catherine Fletcher Reed Darby, she's here. 1816 to 1899, and James Oliver Reed, 1819 to 1905, who moved to Mason, New Hampshire, and he is buried there. And Harriet J. Reed, 1821 to 1907, who never married and inherited the Reed House, and Hannah Reed Willard, 1824 to 1880, who is not buried here. James O. Reed, the son who moved to Mason, his daughter Harriet Reed Strout bought the Reed House from her aunt Harriet Reed's estate and contents separately, and moved there in 1910. Starting in 1942, her daughter, Letty Amanda Strout Proctor, 1884 to 1977, was the 4th generation of the family to own the Reed House. Letty's 2 sons, Hildreth and Robert Proctor, sold the Reed House to the Townsend Historical Society in 1971, ending 164 years of its belonging to the Reed family. And we're very fortunate to have so many of the original Reed family possessions still in the house. If you'd like to know more about the Reed House, you can contact the Townsend Historical Society. Open houses and guided tours are held monthly during the warm months and at Christmas time, and occasionally with other historical society events. Now we're going up the hill, but let's cross over to the next avenue. This is Avenue 1, but Price Ave can't really up with grass. President's family were prominent, civic-minded citizens and benefactors of Townsend for several generations. There are other Fessendens buried in the cemetery and also in local burying ground. Aaron Fessenden was the first of this line to live here, building a large house on what is now Fessenden Hill to the north of town in 1760. A small-scale coopering business was started in the early 1800s by his son Benjamin Fessenden Sr., 1772 to 1839. His son, Benjamin Fessenden Jr., 1805 to 1882, continued the coopering business, building a mill on Hawthorne Brook. He had at least 10 children. I don't know them all, but including Anson, 1839 to 1907. A Civil War hero, Anson went into business with his father after mustering out, creating the B and AD Fessenden Company, which produced the wooden barrels. This company grew to become the largest such company in the United States, with branches throughout the country. Anson was responsible for the town's bandstand existing in the building of Memorial Hall, Townsend's Town Hall, in 1890. It was a memorial to the Civil War veterans and soldiers. He served as the first president of the Townsend Historical Society and oversaw the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic Society of Union Veterans. Anson had two sons, Alfred, 1867 to 1932, known as Fred, and Robert, 1883 to 1945, known as Rob. Alfred served in the state legislature and turned the management of the barrel company over to his brother Robert when he retired in 1912 at the age of 45. Robert built a 3-story facility with conveyor belts to speed up the manufacturing, making it a lucrative business. Alfred had two sons, Stanley, 1904 to 1978, and Donald, 1905 to 1985. Stanley continued the B&AD Fessenden Company, which often employed 200 to 300 men until it closed for good in May 1960, a victim of changing modern times. Stanley is buried with his wife in Lunenburg, where they moved and built a house. But his brother Donald, who went into journalism, is buried here with his wife and their daughter and granddaughter. A little further down Price Avenue here, where the bouquet of flowers is. I think it's a little farther than I can see from here. They have flat stones on the ground. They are not in the Fessenden plot here. Albert Fessenden, 1839 to 1884, was active in leading the local Oddfellows organization and finance committee, as well as being a major supporter of the highway department, school board, and fire department. He and his wife Anne had a lovely home built at the head of the town common. In later years, this became the St. John Rectory, a beautiful building which recently burned. In 1897, Albert's widow Anne endowed a new plot here on Fessenden Hill to be Henry Price's new resting place. Walter also had two daughters, Harriet Nellie Fessenden Powers, 1840 to 1921, and Amanda Elizabeth Fessenden Dwight, 1848 to 1925, who left $51,000 to the town for aid to the poor and both the library and cemetery department use, and the Amanda Dwight Entertainment Fund, which continues to this day to sponsor town entertainment and present patrons. In this plot, there are small stones for Albert and Dan, and to the left for Wilfred, Harriet, Helen, and Amanda Dwight. Amanda left the money. She said that she had committed some unspeakable sin, and she was trying to atone for it by leaving the town money to make up for whatever she had done. We will go next to the monument marker right here, which the Fessendens gave the land for Henry Price's monument. Now, if no one heard the talk on the old burying ground, this will be a sort of a surprise to you. Henry Price, 1697 to 1780, is sometimes referred to as the father of Freemasonry in America, or as we just refer to them, the Masons. Henry Price was born in or near London, England in 1697, came moved to Boston, Massachusetts about 1723 at around 26 years of age. In 1733, he was appointed by warrant from the Grand Lodge of England as Provincial Grand Master of Masons in New England. That same year, he was also appointed cornet in Governor Jonathan Belcher's troop of guards with the rank of Major and became known as Major Price. But this honor was just a position of flag bearer, not an actual cavalry or infantry office. In Boston, Henry became a successful tailor and shopkeeper, and he retired to Townsend in 1761. In Townsend, Price served as representative to the provincial legislature, since this was before the Revolutionary War, in 1764 and 1765, and he owned an estate of several hundred acres, including farms, mills, and shops. He married Mary Townsend when she was 17, and they had a daughter, Mary. But she died his wife died, Mary Townsend died in 1752, and after that he married Mary Tilden, who died in 1759, along with his daughter Mary from his first marriage, dying in 1760. In 1771, when he was 75 years old, he met and married Lydia Randall, a young widow with a son, and together they had two daughters, Mary and Rebecca. Henry died in 1780 at the age of 83, 6 days after being hit in the abdomen by a glancing blow from an axe while he was splitting rails. And he was buried in the old burying ground. And this is a picture of his stone there. It was said to be a yard square. It was a slate stone. It was I think it's much more lovely than the stone that is here. This stone still exists, but it's not here. This large slate stone with the rounded top and winged death head and scroll design down the sides was inscribed with the following lengthy epitaph, and they have some of it on the back, but it's so lengthy that they don't even have the whole thing here. In memory of Henry Price, Esquire, was born in London about the year of our Lord 1697. He removed to Boston about the year 1723, received a deputation appointing him Grand Master of Masons in New England, and in the year 1733 was appointed a cornet in the governor's troop of guards with the rank of Major. By his diligence and industry in business, he acquired the means of comfortable living, with which he removed to Townsend. In the latter part of his life, he quitted mortality the 20th of May, A.D. 1780, leaving a widow and two young daughters, with a numerous company of friends and acquaintances to mourn his death, who have that ground of hope concerning his present lot, which results from his undissembled regard to his Maker and extensive benevolence to his fellow creatures, manifested in life by behavior consistent with his character as a Mason and his nature as a man, an honest man, the noblest work of God. So all that was written on the first slate stone. In 1857, Masonic officials from Boston searched for and found his resting place with the stone fractured almost through its entire length. Well, it didn't really look that bad in the photo. They began an effort to move Henry Price for reburial with elevated status. Well, I guess it's up higher. You could say it's elevated. After resting in peace for over 100 years in the old burying ground, Henry Price's remains were removed and reinterred here in 1888 in a family plot endowed by the family of Albert Fessenden. They actually owned this and they allowed him to be reburied here. A large granite block monument was placed there and dedicated by Governor Endicott. The original gravestone was removed to the Grand Lodge Masonic Building on Boylston and Tremont Streets in Boston. I think it is still there. Every year, the Masonic delegation still visits Price's current resting place in honor of their patron and founder on the Sunday in May that is closest to the date of his death, which was May 20th. In 2008, an especially large delegation of Masons descended to pay tribute, marking the 275th year since the founding of the Masons in America. Henry Price has now been resting at peace in Hillside Cemetery for over 130 years, gone but not forgotten. And as far as I know, he's the only person who has been in this cemetery for over 100 years after being in the old burying ground for over 100 years. Now we're going to walk over this way to the crest of the hill. Down here. And there's thorn bushes, very prickly bushes, Juju. You don't want to go down here. One thing, I know. And this is the area of the tombs. When I came looking last year, when I came to Townsend, like 33 or more years ago, I remember walking with my children down there, and we saw the tombs, and I could not find them last year. Well, I finally did, but they'd really fallen into disrepair. The tombs are a very old and interesting feature of this burying ground, and there are tombs in other old cemeteries in New England. Unfortunately, we will not be able to view them today because of safety issues arising from continuing deterioration of the area on the far side of the hill bordering Bow Street. In the early 1800s, such tombs were a very fashionable option for burial and often purchased in advance. In this case, there are about 13 tombs extending into the side of the hill side by side. They originally had plaques on the tomb doors with the names of the occupants, and the date 1819 when the cemetery first opened. There don't appear to be any other dates on them. Over the years, several of the plaques have become dislodged and have recently been recovered from the leaves and debris at the bottom and placed over the tops of the respective tombs. And Roger Raposa reports that he thinks that only at the most 2 or 3 of the tombs were possibly ever occupied. And there's no record of the burials or occupants in the cemetery department. Also, the location has proven not to be a wise choice here as elsewhere, as erosion has washed away topsoil and vegetation over the years and could result in their eventual collapse. Some large beams are presently propping up the lower area here from below in an effort to prevent them. The hillside just tips forward, and they're trying to prevent that. At the present time, future upkeep and preservation of the tomb section is being pursued with various monument companies, as well as looking into the costs and grants that may be available for such projects. Roger did say there's a video of inside of one of the empty tombs with a mummified bat. But not too much is known or recorded about them. But, Anson Fessenden tried to clean up that area with the Historical Society in the very late 1880s when there were thorn bushes, but it certainly wasn't in as bad shape as it is now. Now, there are other avenues and paths that used to exist for burial in this section of the cemetery, which have now become disused, perhaps because this area is mostly filled up. If you look carefully, you can just make out where these paths wound around the outside. And there's one that comes up here, goes around the outside, or that used to. And last fall was very dry, and I could really clearly see where that path was. And even Price Ave, there's Henry Price, we look at goes over the hill here, is currently not being used by cars, although I didn't know that last fall, and I managed to drive the entire length. And at the back of the cemetery, you can see a few gaps in the wall or fence, which in the past were left that way to allow access for burial from Bow Street. And next we're going to the Nutting Mausoleum, which is right here. We'll go to the other side of it. Many other people buried here that interesting lives. The most imposing structure in this cemetery has to be the Nutting Mausoleum. Mausoleums have been found dating back to at least 353 BC. Technically, a mausoleum is a large and stately freestanding construction serving as a monument enclosing the burial chamber of the deceased and may be considered as a type of tomb. The cemetery department calls this a tomb. This particular example is a stacked drawer family mausoleum housing the remains of several members of the Wilbur C. Nutting family. And several other related Nuttings are also buried in the cemetery. And there are windows, and there actually are drawers stacked up on each side for burial. Wilbur Choate Nutting, 1844 to 1878, originally from Westford, married Emily Maria Hildreth, 1836 to 1915, and they lived in Townsend, where their son and only child, Ellis Zachariah Nutting, 1870 to 1948, was born. Ellis was to become a very wealthy man. He was married in 1892 to Mary Bradstreet, 1871 to 1968 in Ayr, and they had a son and only child, Wendell Sereno Nutting, 1894 to 1976. Now, Pam Bell Heyman down in the cemetery department, she said she had just started working for the cemetery department when he was buried in 1976, or when he was entombed. So she's been there quite a while. But she said that his bearers said that it was so hard to get him up in the top drawer that they hoped that no one would ever, they would never have to do that again. I don't have the paperwork with me, but there was one more burial after that. Ellis and Mary moved to New York City, but they divorced in 1925 with Wendell's parents. and Mary later remarried and is buried in Troy, New York. So his first wife is not here. One of the planners of the Woolworth building in New York City, Ellis also started the popular Woolworth luncheonettes. Has anyone ever eaten a Woolworth luncheonette?
Many years ago.
Well, he started those. I used to love those. And he became a songwriter, having many of his songs published. He went on to become well known as F.W. Woolworth Syndicate's sheet music executive. And back in those days, everyone had a piano or a parlor organ, so sheet music was very popular. He remarried Ruth Belandis, 1900 to 1988, in 1926. As his fortune grew, Ellis and Ruth enjoyed touring and vacationing in Europe. In 1928, they had their lavish winter home built in the Estates neighborhood of Palm Beach, Florida, where Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate is also located. Named Nuestro Paradiso, the Nutting Estate is a Mediterranean-style Gothic mansion, almost a castle, built with details to resemble those of European castles. The magnificent main stairway was used in filming the 1967 movie Tony Rome, starring Frank Sinatra. Ruth outlived Ellis and appears to have remarried, as her last name was Manning when she died in 1988. Ellis's son Wendell went to Williams College and married Mary Margaret Brumbach, 1902 to 1990. They had two daughters, Mary Bradstreet Nutting, 1927 to 2004, who married John Thomas Harmon, 1926 to 2004, and Barbara Hildreth Nutting, born in 1930, who married Noel King Sheldon, 1923 to 1998. And Noel there's a stone for him here, and he served in World War II in Korea. Now, he is not buried, he's a son-in-law, but he is not buried in the mausoleum. And I thought it was interesting that his wife, Barbara, there's no death date that I could find for her, and then I realized that maybe she's still alive. She would be 91 years old, so she could well still be alive. But he died first, so maybe they didn't put him in the mausoleum because she was still alive. It's a beautiful day, and I'm going to end by reading a poem, but before I do, don't feel you have to leave. It's a beautiful cemetery. You may want to visit friends or relatives who are buried here, or just walk around. It's a beautiful place to walk, and thank you for joining me here. This is an anonymous poet. This is a cemetery. Lives are commemorated, deaths are recorded, families are reunited, memories are made tangible, and love is undisguised. This is a cemetery. Communities accord respect. Families bestow reverence. Historians seek information, and our heritage is thereby enriched. Testimonies of devotion, pride, and remembrance are carved in stone to pay warm tribute to accomplishments and to the life, not the death, of a loved one. The cemetery is for family memorials that are a sustaining source of comfort to the living, A cemetery is a history of people, a perpetual record of yesterday, a sanctuary of peace and quiet today. The cemetery exists because every life is worth loving and remembering always. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
You.